Your daughter is alive." The whisper was so soft that it should have disappeared beneath the applause, beneath the clink of champagne glasses, beneath the polished laughter rising through the ballroom of the Palmer House in downtown Chicago. But to Charles Whitmore, it landed like a crack running through marble. He had been standing under a chandelier the size of a small car, smiling the kind of practiced smile billionaires learn to wear when grief has become part of their public image. Around him, 300 guests in black suits and evening gowns applauded the newest scholarship winners of the Emily Whitmore Foundation, a charity named after the little girl the city believed had vanished 12 years ago and never come home. Cameras flashed. Reporters leaned against velvet ropes. A string quartet played something gentle near the far wall, the notes floating over white roses, silver table settings, and a 10-foot portrait of Emily at age 7, blonde hair loose around her shoulders, blue eyes bright, with the kind of hope Charles had spent more than a decade trying not to remember. He had just stepped down from the stage after saying the usual words about legacy, compassion, and helping children feel seen, words printed on thick cards by his communications team, words that sounded noble enough to everyone except the man saying them. Then the girl appeared at his side. She could not have been more than 9. A small black girl in a navy cardigan that had been carefully washed but was beginning to fade at the sleeves, with neat braids tied back by 2 pale blue ribbons, standing very still, as if she had used every ounce of courage just to cross the ballroom floor. In one hand, she held a little denim bag with a broken zipper. On her wrist was a silver bracelet too old-fashioned for a child, its surface scratched, its clasp bent slightly out of shape. Charles might not have noticed her at all if she had not looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too steady for someone so young. "Sir," she whispered again, and this time his breath caught before the words even came. "Your daughter is alive." For one impossible second, the entire room seemed to move without sound. The applause continued, mouths opened and closed. Photographers lifted their cameras. Waiters crossed the carpet with trays balanced on white gloves. But Charles heard nothing except the blood beating in his ears. His fingers tightened around the crystal glass in his hand until the ice shifted with a tiny, nervous click. He looked down at the girl. "What did you say?" His voice came out lower than he intended, rough around the edges, not angry yet, not gentle either. The girl swallowed, but she did not step back. "Emily," she said. "She didn't die." The name struck him harder than the whisper. "Emily. Not Miss Whitmore. Not your child. Emily," spoken with the careful certainty of someone who had been told the name mattered. Charles's eyes moved from her face to her wrist, and that was when the world truly tilted. The bracelet, silver, thin, hand-engraved, with 2 small letters worn almost smooth from years of touch. E.W. Charles stopped breathing. He had bought 2 of them from a tiny jewelry shop in Lake Forest when Emily was 6, one for his daughter and one kept in his office drawer because she had insisted they should have matching treasures. He remembered her standing on the carpet in her yellow rain boots, holding out her wrist and telling him not to lose his half. He had lost far more than that. "Where did you get that?" he asked. The girl's fingers closed protectively over the bracelet. Before she could answer, a woman's voice cut in, smooth as glass and twice as cold. "Charles." Margaret Whitmore appeared beside him in a cream-colored gown, diamonds at her throat, her silver blonde hair pinned perfectly away from a face that had not allowed surprise to settle there for long. She was his younger sister, the public chair of the foundation, the family's most reliable speaker whenever Charles withdrew behind boardrooms and locked doors. To the guests, Margaret looked concerned. To Charles, she looked alert. "Is everything all right?" she asked, glancing at the girl with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "I'm speaking with her," Charles said. Margaret's hand touched his sleeve lightly, a warning disguised as affection. "This is not the place. There are cameras everywhere." The little girl heard that. Charles saw the smallest change in her expression, not fear exactly, but recognition, as if she had expected adults to care first about appearances. She lifted her chin and reached into her denim bag. The zipper snagged. Her small hand worked patiently, tugging until it opened. From inside, she pulled a folded envelope, soft at the corners and yellowed by time. Across the front, written in faded blue ink, were 3 words that made Charles feel the floor drop beneath him. Charles Whitmore only. He knew that handwriting. He had known it in grocery lists, birthday cards, notes left on bathroom mirrors, and the last letter his wife, Eleanor, ever wrote before grief turned her quiet and illness carried her away. Charles stared at the envelope, but did not touch it. Margaret did, or tried to. Her hand moved quickly, almost gracefully, but the girl pulled it back against her chest. The motion was not dramatic. It was careful, decisive. My grandma said not to give it to anyone but him, she said. Margaret's smile tightened. Sweetheart, I'm sure your grandmother meant well, but this is a private event. We can help you outside. No, Charles said. One word. The nearest conversation died instantly. A photographer lowered his camera. A waiter paused beside a table of donors. Somewhere near the stage, the quartet missed a note and recovered too late. Charles finally held out his hand, palm open, the way he might have approached a frightened bird years ago when Emily found one stunned beneath the kitchen window. What's your name? He asked. The girl looked at his hand, then at his face. Nia Brooks. Nia, he repeated, because the name felt like a door he had not known existed. Who gave you that bracelet? Her eyes flickered toward Margaret, then back to him. A woman named Clara kept it safe. She said it belonged to a girl who was hidden because grown-ups lied. A murmur moved through the closest guests, low and uncertain. Margaret's posture changed by half an inch, but Charles saw it. He had spent 30 years reading boardrooms, hostile negotiations, men who smiled before betrayal, women who blinked before admitting. The number was false. His sister had gone still in exactly that way. Charles took the envelope from Nia. The paper trembled, and it took him a second to realize the trembling was his own hand. He slid one finger beneath the flap, but stopped when he saw the seal had already been opened and closed again with old tape. Inside was a photograph, creased down the middle. He pulled it out slowly. A little blonde girl stood beside a black woman in a nurse's uniform outside what looked like a hospital service entrance. The girl's face was turned slightly away, but the bracelet on her wrist caught the sun. On the back, in Eleanor's handwriting, were the words, Emily lived. Don't trust the family file. Charles felt the room narrow until there was only the photograph, the bracelet, the child standing before him, and the portrait of his daughter smiling from across the ballroom like a memory refusing to stay buried. He looked toward Margaret. For the first time in 12 years, she looked afraid. Not enough for the room to notice. Enough for him. Get my car, Charles said to his assistant without looking away from the photo. Margaret leaned closer, her voice barely moving her lips. Charles, think very carefully before you embarrass this family over a story from a child. He turned then, slowly, and the grief that had made him quiet for 12 years sharpened into something colder, clearer, awake. No, he said. For once, I'm going to think carefully about why a child had to bring me the truth. Nia stood beneath the chandelier with her denim bag against her side and the old bracelet shining on her wrist, small in a room full of powerful people, yet somehow the only person there who did not look lost. Charles looked once more at the photograph in his hand, at the words written by the wife he had mourned and misunderstood, and something inside him broke open not like a wound, but like a locked door. 12 years of silence pressed against his chest. 12 years of files, signatures, sealed reports, and condolences from people who had never asked the right questions. Across the ballroom, Emily's painted eyes seemed to watch him. Charles folded the photograph with careful hands, placed it back in the envelope, and looked down at Nia Brooks. Tell me everything, he said. Charles did not lead Nia back into the ballroom. He led her away from it. The moment they passed through the double doors into the private corridor behind the hotel's main event hall, the polished noise of the gala fell behind them like a curtain dropping at the end of a play. Out there, people were still clapping politely, still lifting glasses, still smiling under the gold light, as if nothing had shifted. In the corridor, everything was quieter and colder. The carpet was deep red. The walls were lined with framed photographs of Chicago mayors, charity dinners, ribbon cuttings, and old money pretending it had never been afraid of anything. Charles walked slowly, not because he wanted to, but because he could feel Nia matching every step beside him, and he refused to make a child hurry through a hallway full of strangers. 2 members of hotel security followed at a distance. His assistant, Daniel Price, held a phone to his ear, already canceling meetings, clearing routes, and trying to understand how one whisper from one little girl had turned an ordinary foundation night into something no schedule could contain. Margaret followed too. Charles could feel her behind him before she spoke. Charles, stop. He did not. You are making a mistake, she said, her voice still soft enough for staff not to hear, still shaped like concern. That child has been coached. Look at the timing. Look at the setting. A public event, donors, cameras, your daughter's portrait 10 feet away. Someone wanted maximum emotional damage. Nia's steps slowed at the word child, but she kept her eyes forward. Charles noticed. He had noticed everything since the photograph touched his hand. Her name is Nia, he said. Margaret exhaled through her nose, almost laughing. Fine. Nia. But she should not be here. Charles stopped then, so suddenly Daniel nearly walked into him. He turned toward his sister. Behind her, through the half-open ballroom doors, he could see the chandelier still burning, the crowd still glowing, the portrait of Emily still watching over a room built on grief. Neither should that photograph, he said. Margaret's face did not change much, but something in her eyes tightened. What photograph? Charles held up the envelope. Do not. Her whisper came fast this time. Too fast. Nia looked from Margaret to Charles, and her small fingers wrapped around the strap of her denim bag. Charles lowered the envelope again. That is the second time tonight you have reached for something that does not belong to you. Margaret's lips parted. I was protecting you. From what? From humiliation. No, Charles said quietly. You were protecting the file. The silence that followed was thin and sharp. Daniel looked at the floor. One of the security guards shifted his weight. Nia stood very still, her face calm, but her bracelet hand tucked close to her sweater, as if she understood that adults could smile and still be dangerous to the truth. Margaret took one step closer, lowering her voice until it barely moved the air. You buried your daughter 12 years ago in every way that mattered. Do not let a stranger open that grave because she brought you a scratched bracelet and a sad story. Charles stared at her, and for a second he was not in the hotel corridor anymore. He was back in the rain outside Lake Forest, standing beside police cars, watching red and blue lights spin against wet trees while officers asked questions he could not answer. He remembered Eleanor's hand slipping from his, remembered Margaret telling him to let professionals handle it, remembered the family attorney placing a leather folder on his desk 2 weeks later and saying the investigation had reached its painful conclusion. He had signed papers because grief made the world blurry. He had trusted people because breathing had already taken all his strength. Now a 9-year-old girl had crossed a ballroom and handed him a sentence his own family had never allowed him to ask. Nia finally spoke, not loudly, not pleading. I am not trying to hurt you, sir. Charles looked down at her. I know. Margaret turned toward Nia with a smile so polished it almost looked kind. Sweetheart, grown-up matters can be very confusing. Sometimes people tell children stories because no children repeat them honestly. That does not make the story true. Nia's face warmed with embarrassment, but she did not look away. My grandma says truth does not need to be loud. It just needs to survive long enough. Charles felt those words settle into him. They sounded nothing like something a child had invented for attention. They sounded inherited, carried, protected. Margaret's smile disappeared for half a second. Who is your grandmother? Nia did not answer her. She looked at Charles. Ruth Brooks. The name meant nothing to him, but it hit Margaret like a hand tapping glass in a silent room. She blinked once. Only once. Charles saw it. You know that name, he said. I know hundreds of names, Margaret replied. Our family employed half of Illinois at some point. That was not an answer. Daniel stepped closer, holding the phone against his chest. Mr. Whitmore, the car is at the Monroe Street exit. I also have Miss Brooks's grandmother on the line. She says Nia is safe to speak with you, but she wants her home before it gets too late. Charles nodded, grateful for the ordinary kindness of that sentence. Home before it gets too late. There were still adults in the world who measured time by a child's safety, not a corporation's panic. He turned to Nia. Would you like to call your grandmother yourself? Nia nodded. Daniel handed her the phone. Her voice changed when she spoke into it, becoming smaller, warmer. Grandma, I gave it to him. She listened. Her eyes lifted to Charles once, then dropped again. No, ma'am. I did not let the shiny lady take it. Margaret went pale enough for the hallway lights to show it. Charles almost would have smiled if the moment had not hurt so much. Nia handed the phone back. She said you can read the envelope, but not here. Where? Charles asked. Where people cannot pretend they did not hear. Margaret stepped in immediately. Absolutely not. You are not leaving this hotel with an unknown child and a mystery envelope. Think like the head of this family." Charles turned to her fully. The old version of him might have obeyed that sentence, not because Margaret commanded him, but because the phrase head of this family had always carried the weight of duty, reputation, donors, board seats, and newspaper headlines. But tonight, the title sounded hollow. What kind of head of a family stops asking whether his child is alive because the answer might be inconvenient? "I have thought like the head of this family for 12 years, he said. "Tonight, I am going to think like her father." Margaret's breath caught. In the ballroom behind them, someone began speaking into the microphone, filling the room with warm, practiced words about hope. The sound drifted into the corridor, faint and absurd. Charles turned away from it. He slipped the envelope inside his coat pocket, not as evidence, not as property, but as something fragile enough to deserve protection. Then he offered Nia a respectful distance beside him, not taking her hand, not rushing her, simply making space. "We are going to take you home," he said. "Then I am going to open the old file." Nia nodded once, serious and brave in her faded cardigan beneath hotel lights, made for people who had never had to carry secrets through a crowd. As they walked toward the service elevator, Charles heard Margaret call his name one last time. He did not turn around. He only kept walking beside the little girl who had been called a liar by everyone except the man who finally needed the truth more than he needed peace. The car ride from downtown Chicago to South Side felt longer than the map said it should. Charles sat in the back of the black Lincoln beside the window, the old envelope resting inside his coat pocket like a second heartbeat. Nia sat across from him on the rear-facing seat, her denim bag on her lap, both hands folded over it, her silver bracelet catching brief flashes of streetlight whenever they passed beneath an overpass. Daniel rode in front with the driver, speaking only when necessary, his voice low and careful, as if the air inside the car had become too fragile for ordinary words. Outside, Chicago moved past in layers of glass towers, late-night diners, wet pavement, and apartment windows glowing above corner stores. It was nearly 10 o'clock, and a cold wind dragged loose leaves along the sidewalks. Charles had taken this route countless times for press events, hospital donations, and foundation visits arranged months in advance with clean banners and smiling staff. But he had never seen the city the way he saw it now, through the silence of a child who had carried a secret into his world and watched adults try to take it from her. He looked at Nia's bracelet again, then at her face. She was not sleeping, though any child her age should have been tired after such a night. Her eyes followed the passing blocks as if she were measuring the distance between where she lived and where he came from. "Did Clara give you the envelope?" he asked softly. Nia kept her gaze on the window for a moment. "No, sir. Clara gave it to my grandma before she got too sick to remember things clearly. Grandma Ruth kept it in a cookie tin under the kitchen sink because she said rich people do not look under sinks." The answer landed with a strange kind of wisdom that made Charles ache. "And your grandmother told you to bring it tonight?" Nia nodded. "She saw your foundation on the news. She saw the picture of Emily behind you. She started crying, but not loud, just quiet, like she was trying not to wake up old sadness." Charles turned away before Nia could see how that sentence affected him. He pressed his fingers lightly against the bridge of his nose. For 12 years, he had believed his sadness was private, sealed inside family walls, polished speeches, and locked drawers. Now he understood it had been moving through other homes too, through kitchens with leaking faucets and cookie tins, through women whose names he had never learned because the file had taught him not to ask. When the car stopped in front of a narrow brick house on a quiet block near 76th Street, Nia sat up straighter. A porch light burned above the front steps. The small yard was swept clean, with 2 clay pots beside the railing and a wind chime moving gently in the cold. It was not a house with money, but it was a house with care. Ruth Brooks opened the door before Daniel reached the walkway. She was a black woman in her late 60s, thin but upright, with gray curls tucked beneath a knitted scarf and eyes that looked directly at Charles without surprise. Nia ran to her, not dramatically, just quickly enough to show she had been holding herself steady all evening. Ruth placed one hand on the girl's shoulder and looked over her head at Charles. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. "You came." Charles stepped onto the porch, suddenly aware of his tailored coat, his polished shoes, the watch on his wrist worth more than many cars parked along the block. "I did." Ruth nodded once. as if that was the minimum required of him, not something deserving praise. Then come inside. The neighbors do not need another story tonight. The living room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, peppermint tea, and old wood warmed by a space heater near the couch. Family photographs lined the mantel. Nia at school. Ruth at church. A younger woman with a bright smile who Charles guessed was Clara. Nothing in the room asked for pity. Everything in it asked to be respected. Ruth pointed to a small table near the window. You can open the envelope there. Charles removed it from his coat and sat down, his fingers suddenly clumsy. Nia stood beside Ruth, tucked under her grandmother's arm. Daniel stayed near the door, quiet and watchful. Charles unfolded the photograph again, then found a second item inside the envelope, a thin piece of paper that had stuck to the back. It was not a letter. It was a hospital transfer slip from 12 years earlier, faded but readable, stamped with the name St. Anselm Medical Center. The patient name had been typed as Jane Doe Minor, but beneath it, in blue ink, someone had written one word, Emily. Charles stared at it until the letters blurred. This cannot be real, he whispered, not because he doubted Nia, but because believing it meant admitting he had been blind in the most important moment of his life. Ruth sat across from him. Clara said the same thing when Eleanor gave it to her. Charles looked up sharply. Eleanor knew. Ruth's face softened, but only a little. She suspected. She was weak by then, and people around her kept telling her grief was confusing her. Clara was assigned to private care at your Lake Forest house for 6 weeks. She said your wife kept asking why certain pages in the family file looked newer than others. A chill went through Charles. Newer than others. The phrase opened a door in his memory. The file. The official file. The leather binder Margaret's attorney had placed before him with its clean tabs and final language. Charles stood so quickly the chair legs whispered against the floor. I need to see it. Ruth did not stop him. She only looked at Nia. Baby, get Mr. Whitmore the blue copy. Nia crossed to a kitchen cabinet and pulled out a folder wrapped in a grocery bag. She carried it with both hands, as if it were heavier than paper. Charles accepted it carefully. Inside were photocopied pages, hospital notes, a witness list, and one blurry image of a service hallway. He recognized the format immediately. It matched the official investigation packet, but several details were different. His own copy had never included Clara Brooks's name. His own copy had never mentioned St. Anselm. His own copy had never said transfer under alternate name. The room seemed to narrow around him. Ruth spoke gently, but her words did not soften the blow. Clara believed someone cleaned the file before it reached you. Charles looked down at the page in his hand. At the top was Emily's case number. At the bottom was a signature he knew from every family contract, every foundation document, every controlled statement after the tragedy. Margaret Whitmore. For a long moment, Charles did not move. Then he folded the copy with painful care, placed it back into the folder, and looked at Nia. She was watching him, not with triumph, not with fear, but with the quiet patience of someone waiting to see whether an adult would finally choose truth over comfort. Charles's voice was low when he spoke. I am going home now. Nia's shoulders sank, just slightly, as if she thought he meant he was leaving the truth behind. But he continued, not to sleep. To open every file they told me was closed. Charles left Ruth Brooks's house with the blue copy folder under his arm and a feeling he had not carried in years. Direction. The Lincoln moved north through Chicago under a sky the color of wet steel, past closed laundromats, glowing gas stations, and late buses sighing at corners. Daniel sat beside him this time, not in front, because Charles had asked him to read the pages aloud whenever the streetlights passed bright enough across the paper. Each sentence sounded ordinary at first, the kind of language designed by offices to make human pain feel manageable. Minor female, estimated age 7. Temporary transfer. Private family consultation. Alternate identification pending. But beneath those words, Charles heard the shape of something deliberate. Every clean phrase hit a door. Every missing name felt like a hand placed over a mouth. By the time they reached the Whitmore estate in Lake Forest, nearly 30 miles from downtown, the house looked less like a home and more like a museum of every question he had failed to ask. The iron gates opened without a sound. The long driveway curved between dark trees and winter grass silvered by frost. Upstairs, one window glowed in the east wing, where Margaret kept an office even though she had her own house less than 5 miles away. Charles noticed it immediately. He said nothing. Inside, the marble foyer was quiet except for the ticking of the old grandfather clock and the soft echo of his shoes. He had not entered Emily's wing after midnight in 12 years. No one had, according to the house staff, except cleaners under Margaret's instructions and archivists who came once a year to maintain family records. Charles had allowed that too, because he had confused not looking with surviving. Tonight, survival was not enough. He unlocked the private archive beneath the west staircase with a code he had not used since Eleanor's final winter. The door opened into a narrow room lined with cedar cabinets, fireproof drawers, and framed family documents dating back 4 generations. The air smelled of paper, polish, and the faint chill of places where memory is stored instead of lived. Daniel set the blue copy folder on the central table. Charles opened the main cabinet marked Emily Rose Whitmore, Investigation and Estate Matters. His hands paused on the brass handle. For 1 second, he saw her again at 6 years old, sitting cross-legged on this same floor while he worked nearby, asking why grown-ups kept papers that made them sad. He had told her important things needed to be remembered properly. Now the answer seemed cruel. He pulled the file free. It was heavy, bound in dark leather, labeled with gold lettering too elegant for what it contained. The first pages matched the copy from Ruth's house almost exactly, but only almost. Dates aligned. Case numbers aligned. The language was familiar. Then the differences began. Ruth's copy listed Clara Brooks as attending nurse during the private transfer window. Charles's official file did not. Ruth's copy mentioned St. Anselm Medical Center. Charles's official file replaced that line with County Medical Review. Ruth's copy included a note about alternate identification. Charles's official file had a blank space where that sentence should have been, not torn out, not scribbled over, simply absent, as if the file had been born without the truth. Daniel leaned closer, his face pale beneath the archive light. Mr. Whitmore, these are not clerical differences. No, Charles said. His voice sounded distant to himself. They are choices. He turned page after page. The paper in the official file was too smooth, too white, newer than the surrounding documents. The ink on certain signatures sat differently under the desk lamp, flatter and darker, like copies made long after the fact. Charles took out Eleanor's old magnifying glass from the drawer where she used to keep stationery, held it over the page, and saw tiny pixelated edges around a detective's signature. Scanned, reprinted, placed among real pages and trusted because the man receiving them had been too broken to examine the seams. He sat down slowly. For 12 years, he had believed the file because it was official, because grief loves anything that promises an ending. But this file did not end a story. It buried one. A sound came from the doorway. Not loud, just the smallest breath pulled in too quickly. Charles looked up. Margaret stood there in a silk robe beneath a long gray coat, her hair still pinned from the gala, her face calm in the way a frozen lake is calm. "You should not be down here tonight," she said. Charles did not close the file. "Neither should your signature." Her gaze dropped to the table, then to the blue folder beside it. For the first time, she saw what Ruth had kept. Her expression shifted so quickly another man might have missed it, but Charles was no longer another man. "Where did you get that?" she asked. "From the kind of people our family used to overlook." Margaret stepped inside and closed the archive door behind her with careful control. "You are exhausted. That girl upset you." Her grandmother has clearly held on to confused memories from a painful time. Ruth Brooks remembered more clearly than anyone in this house. Margaret's eyes hardened. "You do not know those people." "No," Charles said, standing. "But Clara Brooks knew my wife. Eleanor knew something was wrong. And you knew enough to remove both of their names from my file." Margaret's mouth tightened. "Be careful." The warning was quiet, but it carried old authority. It had worked on assistants, attorneys, board members, maybe even Charles once. Not now. He turned the official file toward her and tapped the missing line with one finger. "Why is St. Anselm gone?" She did not answer. "Why is Clara gone?" Still nothing. "Why does Ruth have a copy that says my daughter was transferred under another name?" Margaret looked toward the closed door, then back at him. "Because grief makes people cruel, Charles. It makes them invent miracles so they do not have to accept loss." He stared at her for a long moment. "Then why are you afraid of paper?" The question seemed to strike the room itself. Margaret's chin lifted. "I am afraid of what this will do to the family." "The family?" Charles repeated, almost softly. He looked around at the cabinets, the sealed drawers, the polished table, the old portraits watching from the walls. I lost my child, Eleanor lost her peace, and a nurse carried the truth to a grandmother in South Side because someone inside this house decided the family mattered more than Emily. Margaret whispered his name, but he turned away before she could shape it into another command. He opened the final section of the binder, the one marked Closed Findings. There, tucked behind a legal summary, was a hospital invoice. It should have meant nothing, just numbers, dates, billing codes. But one line stopped him cold. Transport service, Lake Forest to Milwaukee, minor female, private account. Charles read it once. Then again. Milwaukee. His pulse slowed into something clear and terrible. He looked back at Margaret, and this time there was no grief clouding his eyes. Only the beginning of understanding. She was moved out of Illinois, he said. Margaret stood perfectly still. Charles picked up the invoice, the blue copy folder, and the photograph from the envelope, gathering them not like a grieving father clutching memories, but like a man collecting proof. Daniel, he said without looking away from his sister, find every hospital, shelter, foster agency, and private clinic connected to St. Anselm or Milwaukee within 48 hours of Emily's transfer date. Daniel nodded, already reaching for his phone. Margaret took one step forward. Charles, if you do this, you will tear open more than you can repair. He placed the photograph of Emily beside the invoice, and the little bracelet in the picture caught the light exactly as Nia's had beneath the chandelier. Then I should have started tearing 12 years ago, he said. By sunrise, the first lie had already reached the news. It appeared first as a small headline on a local business blog, then spread across Chicago phones before most people had finished their coffee. Sources close to the Whitmore family question emotional claims made by unidentified child at charity gala. Charles read the sentence on Daniel's tablet in the back seat of the Lincoln and felt no surprise, only confirmation. The words had Margaret's fingerprints even though her name was nowhere on the screen. Emotional claims. Unidentified child. Charity gala. Every phrase had been chosen to shrink Nia into a disturbance and enlarge the family into a victim. Daniel watched him carefully. There are 3 more articles already. One says the foundation may release a statement this morning. Charles looked out the window as the car moved along Lakeshore Drive, the gray water of Lake Michigan rolling beneath a pale June sky. The foundation will not release anything until I do. Daniel hesitated. Margaret is listed as interim communications chair. Not anymore. The answer came so calmly that Daniel looked down at his tablet and began typing without another question. Charles had slept less than 1 hour, if the brief darkness in his study chair could be called sleep. The rest of the night had been spent with hospital invoices, old call logs, and 3 attorneys who sounded awake only after he said the words family misconduct investigation. By 6 in the morning, a private forensic document examiner had confirmed what Charles already knew in his bones. Several pages in the official Emily file had been recreated years after the original investigation. By 7, Daniel had found a narrow connection between St. Anselm and a pediatric rehabilitation clinic outside Milwaukee that had closed in 2015. By 7:30, Margaret's article appeared. By 8, Charles was on his way back to South Side, not for evidence this time, but for protection. When the Lincoln turned onto Ruth Brooks's block, a news van sat near the corner. A young reporter stood on the sidewalk holding a paper coffee cup, speaking into a phone while a camera operator leaned against the van. Charles's jaw tightened. The porch light on Ruth's house was still on. The curtains were drawn. Nia's clay pots stood untouched beside the railing, small and brave against the morning chill. Pull up in front, Charles said. Daniel looked at the news van. That will draw attention. Good. The car stopped at the curb. Before the reporter could fully recognize him, Charles stepped out. The cold air hit his face, clean and sharp. The reporter straightened immediately. Mr. Whitmore, is it true that your family was approached by a child making claims about your late daughter? Charles did not look at the camera. He looked at the house. It is true that a child came to me with information adults should have had the courage to examine. The reporter blinked, surprised by the answer. So you are saying you believe her? Charles turned then. His eyes were tired, but steady. I am saying her name is Nia Brooks. She is 9 years old. She is not a rumor, not an unidentified child, and not a headline. Anyone who tries to harass her or her grandmother will answer to my legal team before lunch. The camera operator lifted the lens. Charles held up one hand, not angrily, simply with the authority of a man who had spent decades ending rooms with silence. Do not film the house. The lens lowered. A few seconds later, Ruth opened the front door. She looked at the reporter first, then at Charles, and something in her expression said she had expected the world to become uglier before it became honest. "Morning," she said. "Good morning, Miss Brooks," Charles replied. "I am sorry they came here. You did not send them. Someone did." Ruth studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. Inside, the house felt different in daylight. Smaller, warmer, more vulnerable. A kettle hummed softly in the kitchen. Nia sat at the table in her school uniform, though her backpack rested unopened on the chair beside her. Her braids were tied with the same pale blue ribbons from the gala, but her eyes were shadowed with a sleepless seriousness no child should have to wear. She had Daniel's printed articles in front of her, each one turned face down as if words could bruise less when hidden. Charles stopped several feet away, giving her space. "Nia," he said gently, "I should have protected your name before they tried to use it." She looked up. "They said I lied." The sentence was small, not broken, and that made it hurt more. Ruth placed a hand on the back of Nia's chair. Charles pulled out the chair across from her and sat, not like a billionaire visiting a poor family, but like a man asking permission to sit in the presence of someone who had done what he had not. "People who fear the truth often attack the messenger first," he said. "That does not make you a liar. It makes them afraid." Nia looked at her bracelet, turning it slowly around her wrist. "Miss Margaret said grown-up matters confuse children." Charles's face tightened, but his voice stayed calm. "Miss Margaret has spent many years making grown-up matters confusing for grown-ups too." A flicker of something almost like a smile touched Nia's mouth, then faded. "Are you going to stop looking because of the news?" Charles reached into his coat and placed a copy of the Milwaukee invoice on the table, turned so Ruth could read it first. "No, I am going to look harder." Ruth leaned forward. Her eyes moved across the page. "Milwaukee," she whispered. "Clara said there was a van." Charles looked at her carefully. She remembered that? Ruth nodded. "Not always." Near the end, her memory came and went. But that part stayed. A private van. A woman with pearl earrings. A man carrying papers. Clara said Eleanor kept saying, "If they move her, follow the paperwork." Charles closed his eyes briefly. Eleanor had been ill, doubted, surrounded by people who called her grief confusion, and still she had left a trail. Not loud, not perfect, but enough for a nurse, a grandmother, and a child to keep alive. Daniel's phone rang near the doorway. He answered, listened, and turned toward Charles with a changed expression. The clinic outside Milwaukee had a linked records archive transferred to a church charity after it closed. St. Bridget's Family Services. They still have boxes in storage. Charles stood. "Contact them." Daniel covered the phone. "Already did." Their director said old medical records require authorization or law enforcement. Ruth looked from Daniel to Charles. "Then you need someone who remembers the case." Charles nodded slowly. Detective Aaron Miller. The name had sat buried in the old file, one signature among many, but Ruth's copy had shown his handwritten note beside Clara's statement. He had been the only investigator who questioned the transfer language before the file went clean. "He retired years ago," Daniel said. "Find him." Nia stood then, her chair softly scraping the floor. "I want to go." Ruth's hand tightened slightly on her shoulder, protective but not silencing. Charles shook his head gently. "Not to a records office. Not today. There are reporters outside, and this is an adult fight now." Nia's chin lifted. It was an adult fight before. That is why nobody listened. The room went still. Charles absorbed the words without defending himself. She was right. Every adult in the story had either hidden the truth, feared it, softened it, sold it, or filed it away. The child had carried it. "Then I will say it differently," he said. "You have already done the brave part. Now it is my turn to do the responsible part." Nia looked at him for a long moment, testing whether that was a promise or just another polished sentence. Then she nodded once. Charles turned to Ruth. "I am assigning a security team outside, discreet and respectful. No uniforms at your door, no cameras, no disruption. My attorneys will handle the press. If you need anything, Daniel answers immediately." Ruth crossed her arms. "We are not charity work, Mr. Whitmore." No, Charles said. You are witnesses. And you are people my family should have protected a long time ago. Ruth's expression softened by one careful degree. Nia reached into her denim bag and pulled out a small blue envelope, different from the first, folded twice and sealed with tape. Grandma said this was only if you did not run away. Charles looked at Ruth. Ruth shrugged, but her eyes shone. Clara believed in tests. Charles accepted the envelope with both hands. Inside was a cassette label, no tape, just the label peeled from one long ago. On it, written in shaky black marker, were 4 words and an address. Miller heard her voice. Beneath it was a street in Oak Park. Detective Aaron Miller Street. Charles felt the path ahead sharpen again. He placed the label carefully inside his coat pocket beside the photograph and the invoice. Outside, the news van remained at the curb, but it seemed smaller now, less powerful than the quiet kitchen where a little girl's courage had survived the morning. Charles looked at Nia one last time before leaving. I am still listening, he said. Nia touched the bracelet on her wrist. Then she still has a chance. Detective Aaron Miller lived on a quiet street in Oak Park, in a small brick bungalow with a flag on the porch, a wind chime near the door, and a row of tomato plants lined up in 5-gallon buckets along the driveway. Nothing about the house suggested scandal, old money, or buried evidence. It looked like the kind of place where a retired man might water his lawn before breakfast, wave to neighbors, and keep the television volume too high during baseball season. Charles stood at the front walk with Daniel beside him and the blue envelope label folded in his pocket, feeling strangely less prepared than he had felt before hostile takeovers, federal hearings, and rooms full of investors waiting for him to fail. Those rooms had rules. This one had memory. Daniel rang the doorbell. A dog barked once from somewhere inside. Then a woman's voice called for it to be quiet. The door opened a few inches. Aaron Miller was older than the file photograph, of course, but not softer. He had white hair cut close, square shoulders beneath a faded Northwestern sweatshirt, and sharp gray eyes that landed first on Charles, then on Daniel, then on the black Lincoln at the curb. His face changed in a way that told Charles he had been expecting this day and dreading it for years. Mr. Whitmore, Miller said. Charles nodded. Detective Miller. Not detective anymore. You signed the first file. Miller looked past him toward the street, then stepped back. Then you had better come in before someone else signs the next lie. The house smelled like coffee, lemon oil, and old books. A golden retriever watched them from a rug near the hallway, tail thumping once before losing interest. Miller led them to a dining room where stacks of newspapers sat beside prescription bottles and a neat pile of crossword puzzles. On the wall hung framed commendations, a black and white photo of Miller in uniform, and a picture of him with 2 grown sons at what looked like Wrigley Field. Ordinary life, Charles thought, built around an extraordinary silence. Miller's wife brought coffee without asking questions, touched his shoulder once, then disappeared into the kitchen. Miller waited until she was gone before speaking. I wondered when Ruth Brooks would finally send somebody. Charles sat very still. You knew Ruth? I knew Clara. Ruth came later, after Clara got scared. Daniel placed the copied folder on the table. Miller did not touch it. He looked at it the way a man looks at a grave he helped dig, because someone told him it was already too late. Why did you stop? Charles asked. The question had lived in him since he read Miller's handwritten note. It came out sharper than he intended, but Miller did not flinch. Because I was made to stop. By whom? Miller's mouth moved, almost a smile, but there was no humor in it. People with clean hands and expensive lawyers. Your sister among them. Not alone, but she was in the room. Charles felt Daniel shift beside him. The house clock ticked above the sideboard. Tell me what happened. Miller folded his hands on the table. They were large hands, marked by age, one finger bent slightly from an old injury. The official story was that Emily disappeared during a family event, that the weather complicated the search, that a later medical finding supported the assumption she had not survived the initial window. That is what you were told. Charles's voice was almost a whisper. Yes. That was not what we had in the first 48 hours. Miller stood slowly and walked to a cabinet beneath the framed baseball photograph. He unlocked the lower drawer with a key from his pocket and pulled out a metal recipe box. It was the kind of thing someone's grandmother might use for index cards, not evidence. He placed it on the table. I kept what I could keep without losing my pension and my family. It was not enough, but it was not nothing. Inside were folded notes, an old microcassette, and 2 photographs in plastic sleeves. Miller laid them out carefully. One showed the service entrance of St. Anselm Medical Center. The other showed the rear of a private medical van, its license plate blurred but partly visible. Charles leaned forward, his chest tightening. Milwaukee. Eventually, Miller said. But first she was moved through St. Anselm. Clara Brooks saw her. Alive. Drowsy, confused, but alive. Clara told me the child asked for her father. Charles closed his eyes. The room seemed to tilt, not violently, but with the quiet cruelty of a truth arriving late. His daughter had asked for him while he had been somewhere signing statements, trusting summaries, being managed. Miller's voice softened. I am sorry. Charles opened his eyes again. Sorry does not. Tell me who moved her. Miller nodded, accepting that. He picked up the microcassette. This might. Daniel's phone was newer than everything in the room, but Miller had an old recorder in the drawer, wrapped in a dish towel like a sacred object. He set it in the center of the table, inserted the cassette, and pressed play. Static filled the dining room first, a thin hiss like rain against a window. Then came a woman's voice, weak but clear enough to make Charles's entire body go still. Eleanor. Aaron, please listen. They are telling Charles the first am confused. I am not confused. Emily was at St. Anselm. Clara saw her bracelet. If they move her again, follow the paperwork, not the family. Margaret knows more than she says. Please, if I cannot reach him, keep this somewhere safe. The recording clicked, then continued with a second voice, Clara's, lower and trembling with urgency. There was a private van. No county seal. The form said temporary transfer, but the name was changed before they took her. Jane Doe first, then Lena. I saw Lena written on the blue sheet. Brooks was not on it then. That came later. I think they are hiding her in plain sight. The tape ended. No dramatic music. No confession shouted into the dark. Just 2 women trying to keep a child from disappearing behind paperwork. Charles stared at the recorder. His hands rested on the table, open, empty. For the first time since Nia's whisper, he looked less like a billionaire hunting evidence, and more like a father hearing how close his child had once been to home. Lena, he said. Miller nodded. That is the name we could never trace cleanly. There were too many private placements, sealed foster transfers, charitable medical programs. Whoever designed it knew how systems lose children without leaving fingerprints. Daniel looked up from the folder. St. Bridget's Family Services took over records from the Milwaukee clinic after it closed. Miller's eyes sharpened. Then that is where you go next. Charles looked at him. Come with us. Miller laughed once under his breath, tired and bitter. I am 72 years old. You are the only investigator who did not look away. I looked away for 12 years. No, Charles said, nodding toward the recipe box. You looked down and kept something alive. Miller's wife appeared in the doorway, silent, her hands folded in front of her. She looked at her husband with the kind of fear that had been repeated in private for many years, but also with a small, tired permission. Miller saw it. His shoulders lowered. He picked up the photograph of the van and slid it into the folder. If I do this, we do it properly. Lawyers. Court orders. No back doors. Charles nodded. Properly. Miller turned to Daniel. And protect the Brooks family. If Margaret knows Ruth passed this forward, she will try to make them look unreliable. Already in progress, Daniel said. Charles stood, but before he could step away, Miller held up one final note. It was a strip of hospital stationery, yellowed at the edges. On it, in Eleanor's handwriting, was a sentence Charles had not known he needed until he saw it. Charles, if you read this, believe the child who brings you the bracelet. He took the paper carefully, as if pressure alone could make it vanish. Nia had not simply carried a secret. She had been expected, trusted by a woman she never met, chosen by a truth that had waited longer than any child should have had to wait. Charles placed the note beside the photograph, the invoice, and the cassette. The path ahead led north now, toward Milwaukee, toward sealed boxes in a church charity basement, toward a name that might belong to the daughter he had mourned in the wrong tense. As he stepped back onto the porch, the morning had brightened, and the wind moved softly through Miller's chimes. Charles looked toward the street, then toward the folder under Daniel's arm. For 12 years, the file had told him the story was over. Now the people the file erased were speaking, one by one, and the silence around Emily Whitmore was finally beginning to fail. The road to Milwaukee should have felt like progress, but Charles knew truth rarely moved in a straight line. By early afternoon, Daniel had secured a court-authorized records request through a family law judge who had once worked missing children cases before moving to the civil bench. Detective Aaron Miller rode with them in the back of the Lincoln, his old recipe box resting on his knees like something both ordinary and holy. Charles sat beside him, watching Illinois flatten into Wisconsin through tinted glass, while the sky brightened and dimmed behind passing clouds. For most of the drive, no one spoke. The folder between them held Eleanor's note, Clara's recorded voice, the hospital invoice, the van photograph, and the name Lena, written again and again in places where Emily should have been. Charles had spent his life believing power meant speed, private planes, direct calls, doors opened before he touched them. Now power meant waiting for signatures, respecting procedures, protecting a child from cameras, and letting an old detective guide him through the only kind of investigation that would hold in daylight. They were 20 miles outside Milwaukee when Daniel's phone vibrated. He read the screen, and his expression changed before he answered. "Mr. Whitmore," he said carefully. "Margaret is at the corporate tower. She has called an emergency board session." Charles did not look away from the window. "For what purpose?" Daniel listened, then lowered the phone. "To question your capacity to act on behalf of the Foundation and Whitmore Global while under emotional distress." Miller gave a dry breath through his nose. "That was fast." Charles finally turned. "No, that was prepared." Daniel's phone buzzed again. A message appeared from the Foundation's legal counsel, then another from a board member, then a third from a public relations firm Charles had not hired. The screen filled with clean language designed to sound responsible. Temporary oversight, reputational stability, family sensitivity, independent review. Charles read none of it twice. Margaret was not trying to stop him because she thought he was wrong. She was trying to stop him because he was close. "Turn around," he said. Daniel blinked. "The records appointment is in 2 hours. St. Bridget's will keep the boxes for a court order. Margaret will not keep her mouth closed for 2 hours." Miller studied him. "You sure?" Charles looked at the folder. "If I let her define this before we do, Nia becomes a hoax, Ruth becomes unreliable, Clara becomes confused, Eleanor becomes grief-stricken, and Emily disappears again." The Lincoln took the next exit and headed back toward Chicago. The whole way, Charles said very little. He made 4 phone calls. One to his attorney. One to the judge's clerk, requesting the records hold remain active. One to Daniel's media contact, instructing him that no statement would be issued until Charles delivered it himself. The last call was to Ruth Brooks. He asked only if Nia was home and safe. Ruth said yes. In the background, he heard Nia ask whether the boxes had Emily's name on them. Charles closed his eyes for a second. "Not yet," he said. "But they will." When the Lincoln pulled beneath the glass entrance of Whitmore Global Tower, the building rose 70 stories over the Chicago River, cold and silver against the afternoon sky. Inside, the lobby smelled of polished stone, expensive coffee, and fresh flowers no one ever stopped to smell. Employees watched from behind security gates as Charles entered with Daniel on one side and Miller on the other. A few lowered their voices. A few lifted phones, then thought better of it when Charles looked their way. The elevator climbed in silence to the executive floor. At the top, Margaret's meeting was already underway behind frosted glass. Charles could hear her voice before he entered, calm, sorrowful, perfectly rehearsed. "My brother has endured an unimaginable wound, and last night that wound was exploited in a public setting by individuals whose motives remain unclear." Charles opened the door. Every head turned. 12 board members sat around the long walnut table. Foundation counsel stood near a screen displaying a draft resolution. Margaret sat at the far end in a pale gray suit, pearls at her throat, hands folded over a leather portfolio. For a moment, she looked less like his sister and more like the file itself, elegant, sealed, and arranged to hide what mattered. "Continue," Charles said. His voice was quiet, but it filled the room. Margaret recovered first. "Charles, we were hoping you would join us after you had rested." "I rested for 12 years. No one moved." Charles walked to the table and placed the folder in front of him. Miller stayed near the wall, visible but silent. Margaret's eyes flicked toward him, and that single movement told Charles she remembered exactly who he was. This meeting is not authorized, Charles said. The Foundation Charter requires my written consent for emergency removal of executive authority, unless a medical incapacity certification is filed by 2 independent physicians. You have neither. Counsel cleared his throat. Mr. Whitmore, this is preliminary. Then preliminarily, sit down. The attorney sat. Margaret's cheeks warmed, but her tone remained controlled. You are proving the concern, Charles. This is emotional. A little girl appeared with a bracelet and a story, and now you are accusing your own family. Charles opened the folder and took out the copied hospital transfer slip. A little girl appeared with evidence. He placed the invoice beside it. A nurse preserved what your file erased. He placed Eleanor's note next. My wife left instructions because she knew someone close enough to us could control what I saw. Margaret's gaze hardened. Eleanor was not well. Charles looked at her. Say that carefully. The room became very still. Margaret leaned back. I loved Eleanor. I loved Emily. Everything I did after that night was to keep this family standing. Miller spoke for the first time. Standing on what, Miss Whitmore? Her eyes cut to him. You have no role here. I had a role until someone made sure I did not. Charles kept his eyes on Margaret. Why was St. Anselm removed from my file? I do not know. Why was Clara Brooks removed? I do not remember every clerical choice from 12 years ago. Why did your communications team leak Nia's name before sunrise? Margaret paused. It was brief, but every board member saw it. I did not leak her name. No, Charles said. You leaked everything except her name, so the press could hunt for the child without you appearing cruel enough to point. One of the board members shifted uncomfortably. Margaret's hand tightened around her pen. Charles saw the crack. Not a collapse. Just the first thin fracture in polished stone. This is absurd, she said. Even if the child survived some confusion at a hospital, you have no proof that she is alive now. No proof that this Lena is Emily. No proof that anything criminal occurred. Charles nodded slowly. That is the first honest sentence you have said all day. We do not yet have proof that Lena is Emily. So why are you trying to stop us from finding her? Margaret stood. Because if you drag this family through another public tragedy, you will destroy everything Emily's name built. Charles stared at her. Emily's name did not build this. Her absence did. And you managed it like an asset. The words struck the room harder than a shout would have. Margaret's face changed then, not into guilt, not fully, but into anger sharpened by fear. You have no idea what it took to keep the company, the foundation, the trust, the estate, all of it from collapsing while you wandered around this house like a ghost. Maybe not, Charles said. But I know a living child was more important than a stable stock price. Her lips parted. The room held its breath. Then she said it, quietly, bitterly, as if the truth had slipped out only because pride opened the door. That bracelet was supposed to stay with the closed file. Daniel looked up. Miller's eyes narrowed. Charles felt the sentence pass through him with perfect clarity. Margaret realized too late what she had said. The board members looked from her to the folder, to Charles, to Miller. No one asked what bracelet. No one had to. Charles reached into his pocket and removed a small device Daniel had given him before entering the building, not hidden for scandal, but present for record in a meeting where legal authority was being challenged. The red light glowed steadily. Margaret's face went white beneath the boardroom lights. Charles placed the recorder on the table between them. Thank you, he said, his voice low and almost mournful, for finally putting yourself in the file. The recording changed the temperature of the boardroom. No one raised a voice after that. No one needed to. Margaret sat slowly, not because she accepted defeat, but because every person at the table had heard the sentence she could not pull back. Charles did not stay to watch her explain it away. He left the recorder with his attorney, ordered the emergency board session suspended, and walked out with Daniel and Aaron Miller before the room could wrap the truth in another layer of legal language. By late afternoon, they were on the road to Milwaukee again, this time with a signed preservation order, a retired detective who had stopped apologizing and started remembering, and a folder that felt heavier with every mile. The city thinned behind them. Chicago's towers gave way to warehouses, then suburbs, then long stretches of highway bordered by summer grass and low clouds. Charles sat in the back seat with Eleanor's note folded carefully inside his jacket. Believe the child who brings you the bracelet. He had read the sentence so many times that the paper had begun to soften at the crease. The words no longer felt like a message from the past. They felt like instructions for the next hour. St. Bridget's Family Services stood on a quiet street on the south side of Milwaukee, attached to an old brick church with a green copper roof and a playground behind a chain-link fence. The building was humble, nothing like the institutions Charles usually entered. No marble lobby. No private reception desk. Just a small office with a bulletin board full of community meal schedules, tutoring flyers, foster parent information, and a hand-painted sign that said every child deserves to be known. The director, a woman named Teresa Walsh, met them at the front desk with reading glasses on a chain and a cautious kindness in her eyes. She had already spoken to the judge's clerk and the family attorney. She had also, Charles suspected, spoken to enough frightened people in her life to know when money was trying to move too fast. "These records are old," she said as she led them down a narrow hall. "Some were damaged when the clinic closed. Some were transferred without proper indexing. I cannot promise what is there." Miller walked beside her, slower now, but alert. "We are not asking for promises. Just boxes." Teresa unlocked a basement storage room beneath the church office. The light flickered twice before holding steady. Metal shelves lined the walls, stacked with bankers' boxes marked by year, program name, and case range. The air smelled of cardboard, dust, and floor cleaner. Charles stood at the threshold, and for a moment his courage faltered. Somewhere in this room, his daughter might exist only as a changed name on a faded form. Somewhere in this room, the life he had mourned could become the life he had missed. Daniel noticed, but said nothing. Miller placed a hand on one shelf. "Start with clinic transfers, June and July, 12 years ago." They worked for nearly an hour. Teresa read box labels. Daniel photographed inventory sheets. Miller checked every index page with the patience of a man who knew one overlooked line could hide a child. Charles opened folders carefully, each paper lifted as if it had nerves. There were dozens of children. Initials instead of names. Temporary guardianships. Medical referrals. Emergency placements. Some files were incomplete. Some had coffee stains or staple rust. The ordinary mess of underfunded systems sat in front of him, and Charles felt a new kind of shame. He had donated millions to causes like this, smiled at cameras, funded buildings, and never understood how easily a child could become paperwork passed between tired hands. Then Daniel stopped moving. "Mr. Whitmore." Charles turned. Daniel held a thin folder with a blue intake sheet clipped to the front. The name at the top read Lena M. No last name entered at admission. Age estimated 7. Transfer source, St. Anselm Medical Center. Distinguishing item, silver identification bracelet, engraved initials. Charles crossed the room slowly, his eyes fixed on the line. Engraved initials. His hand hovered above the paper before he touched it. "Read the guardian note," Miller said quietly. Teresa adjusted her glasses. Temporary placement authorized through private family intermediary. Later assigned to Brooks' affiliated care network, pending identity review. Charles looked up. "Brooks." Teresa frowned. "That does not necessarily mean Ruth Brooks. There were several family care providers using that network name. But there is a later update." She turned the page. "Child placed with Clara Brooks for short-term medical supervision before transfer to foster education program." The room went silent except for the hum of the overhead light. Clara had not only seen Emily. Clara had held the line long enough to keep part of her safe. Charles gripped the edge of the shelf. Where did she go after Clara? Daniel took the next page, scanning quickly. There is a sealed adoption-adjacent guardianship record. Not a formal adoption. Name updated to Lena Marie Brooks, then later Lena Marie Bennett after placement with a couple in Wauwatosa. Parents deceased. Current adult contact listed through a records amendment from 6 years ago. He swallowed. Lena Brooks. Milwaukee Public Schools. Music educator. Charles closed his eyes. The name was no longer a shadow. It had a profession, a city, a life, address. Daniel looked at Teresa. Teresa hesitated. Adult contact information is protected. With the court order and potential identity restoration, I can release it to counsel, not for public exposure, and only if contact is handled respectfully. Charles opened his eyes. Respectfully is the only way I want it handled. 20 minutes later, they sat in the Lincoln outside a public elementary school in a quiet Milwaukee neighborhood. School had ended, but a few cars remained in the lot. Children's drawings filled the windows near the entrance. Sons, music notes, trees, handprints in bright paint. Charles had faced hostile billionaires without sweating, but now he could barely open the car door. Miller did not push him. Daniel did not speak. Across the lot, a woman stepped out of the side entrance carrying a canvas tote and a stack of sheet music. She was in her early 30s, with light brown hair pulled loosely back, a blue cardigan, and a calm, attentive way of moving, as if she was still listening for children even after the children had gone home. She paused to lock the door behind her, then turned toward the parking lot. Charles saw Eleanor first, not in the color of her hair or the shape of her face alone, but in the way she lifted one hand to tuck a loose strand behind her ear. A small, unconscious gesture. The same gesture Emily had copied at 6 years old while pretending to read beside her mother on the porch. Charles did not move. The woman looked toward the Lincoln, curious but not alarmed. Daniel stepped out first, keeping both hands visible and his voice gentle. Miller followed, badge retired but manners still careful. Charles remained by the open car door, as if crossing the pavement too quickly might steal something from her. The woman approached only a few steps. "Can I help you?" Her voice was kind, professional, slightly guarded. Miller spoke. "Miss Brooks." "Yes." Charles's breath caught at the name. Lena Brooks looked from Miller to Daniel, then to Charles. Something in her expression shifted, not recognition, but a strange awareness, the way people feel weather change before rain begins. Charles reached into his pocket, then stopped. Not the photograph, not the legal papers, not yet. Those were adult weapons, even when used for truth. Instead, he turned to Daniel. "Call Ruth," he said softly. "Ask if Nia is with her." Daniel nodded, understanding before Charles explained. 10 minutes later, on a secure video call, Nia's face appeared on Daniel's phone from Ruth's kitchen in Chicago. She wore her school uniform and the silver bracelet. Charles held the phone carefully, not toward himself, but toward Lena. Nia looked at the woman on the screen, then at the matching older bracelet Teresa had found photographed in the file, now resting in a clear evidence sleeve in Miller's hand. For a moment, the little girl who had carried the truth seemed to understand that this was bigger than proof. This was a person. Nia's voice was soft. "I think something was waiting for you." Lena stared at the bracelet through the screen, and all the color left her face. She reached into her tote with trembling fingers and pulled out a small tin box covered in faded flower stickers. From inside, she took a broken half of a silver bracelet, worn smooth at the edge, engraved with the faint remains of 2 letters. EW. Charles placed one hand on the open car door to steady himself. Lena looked at him then, truly looked, and her voice was barely audible above the wind. Moving across the school parking lot. "Why do I have your daughter's bracelet?" Charles could not answer as a billionaire, as a founder, as a man accustomed to filling silence. He could only answer as a father who had arrived 12 years late and finally understood that the living deserved more care than the dead. "I do not know everything yet," he said, his voice breaking quietly. "But I believe you were taken from the truth. And I believe my daughter may have grown up into you." The first test was not a reunion. It was a cotton swab in a quiet clinic room, a legal consent form, and 3 people sitting beneath fluorescent lights while the truth moved through a process too small to hold its weight. Lena Brooks signed her name with a hand that stayed steady only because she forced it to. Charles signed his beside hers, careful not to look as if he expected anything from her beyond permission. Aaron Miller stood near the door with Daniel, speaking softly to the clinic director, making sure every step was documented, witnessed, and protected. No cameras waited outside. No family spokesperson issued a statement. No headline was allowed to reach Lena before the facts did. Charles had insisted on that. He had already lost 12 years to people who treated a child like an asset inside a file. He would not make the same mistake by treating a grown woman like the final scene of his grief. When the nurse finished, Lena folded her hands in her lap and looked down at the small tin box resting beside her purse. Inside were the broken bracelet half, 2 school photos from her childhood, a faded hospital wristband with the name Lena M., and a scrap of paper she had carried since she was 16 without knowing why. It said, in handwriting she had never been able to place, "Sing when you are scared." Charles recognized Eleanor in the curve of the letters and had to turn toward the window until he could breathe again. The results came 2 days later, at a conference room in St. Bridget's Family Services, not at Whitmore Tower, Because Lena said she did not want the first official answer about her life delivered inside a building owned by strangers. Teresa Walsh read the report aloud with a tenderness that made even the legal language feel human. Probability of biological parentage exceeded 99.99%. For a moment, no one spoke. The air conditioner hummed. A delivery truck passed outside. Somewhere down the hall, children laughed in an after-school program, their voices bright and ordinary. Charles closed his eyes. The world did not explode. The lights did not change. His daughter did not become 7 again. Tom did not apologize. Lena sat across from him, alive, 32 years old, a music teacher with a mortgage, favorite coffee, students who adored her, and memories he did not share. The truth gave him back his daughter, but it did not give him ownership of her pain. When he opened his eyes, she was watching him. "So Emily is my name," she said quietly. Charles swallowed. It was. She nodded slowly, testing the sound against the life she knew. "And Lena is my name too." "Yes," he said at once. "No one gets to take that from you." Her expression changed then, not into joy, not yet, but into relief that he had not asked her to erase herself in order to heal him. Across the table, Ruth Brooks held Nia's hand. They had driven up from Chicago that morning in a car Charles provided, but Ruth approved only after checking the driver's name, license plate, and route. Nia wore a yellow sweater and the silver bracelet, her braids tied back with white ribbons this time. She had been very quiet since entering the room, as if she understood that courage sometimes meant stepping back after carrying the message forward. Lena looked at her, then at the bracelet on her wrist. "You brought him to me," she said. Nia shook her head. "I brought him to the truth. You were already here." Charles looked at the child who had said that, and something in him bowed without moving. Margaret's fall did not happen in a single dramatic moment. It unfolded through subpoenas, audits, archived emails, board resignations, and interviews with investigators who no longer allowed family reputation to shape the questions. Her recorded sentence opened the door. The documents behind it widened the room. The foundation removed her authority within 48 hours. Whitmore Global placed all family estate matters under independent review. The police reopened the original case with Miller serving as a formal consultant, and for the first time in 12 years, Clara Brooks's name entered the official record as a witness, not a missing footnote. Charles did not hold a press conference from a stage. He stood outside Ruth's small brick house with one local reporter, one camera, his attorney, and Ruth's permission. He said only what needed to be said, that a child had been brave, that adults had failed, that a woman named Lena deserved privacy, and that the Emily Whitmore Foundation would be renamed the Truth Fund, dedicated to helping children and families lost inside broken systems find records, advocates, and answers. He did not say Nia saved him, though she had. He did not say money could repair the years, because it could not. He did not promise a perfect ending. He promised transparency, protection, and patience. Weeks later, on a warm Saturday evening, Charles invited Lena, Ruth, and Nia to dinner at a small Italian restaurant in Oak Park instead of the Whitmore estate. Lena chose the place because her students' families went there after school concerts, and because no one there would stare at silverware long enough to make her feel examined. Charles arrived early and waited outside, not in the private room Daniel had reserved, but on the sidewalk near a planter full of red geraniums. When Lena walked up with Nia and Ruth, she paused a few feet away. Charles did not reach for her. He did not say Emily first. He did not ask for a hug that belonged to a past she could not remember. He simply held out a small velvet pouch. "This was mine," he said. "The other half of the bracelet set. I kept it in a drawer for 12 years because I thought keeping it hurt less than looking at it." Lena opened the pouch. Inside was the matching silver bracelet, scratched less than hers, but aged by the same time. She touched it with one finger, then looked at him. "Are you giving it to me?" "Only if you want it." She thought for a long moment, then closed the pouch and handed it back. Charles's face changed, just slightly, but he nodded. He accepted it without argument. Lena saw that and softened. "Not yet," she said. "Maybe someday. Tonight, I just want dinner." Charles looked down at the pouch in his hand, then back at her. The old version of him might have felt rejected. The man Nia had awakened understood that not yet was not a closed door. It was an honest one. "Dinner," he said. Nia slipped her small hand into Ruth's and smiled at the sidewalk. Inside, They sat near the window. Lena talked about her music classes. Ruth talked about church ladies who pretended not to gossip while knowing everything by sunrise. Nia told Charles that his foundation needed better snacks at children's events because rich people always served tiny sandwiches that looked scared. Charles laughed, really laughed, and the sound surprised him so much that Lena smiled. Near the end of the meal, when the sun lowered behind the street and gold lights spread across the table, Charles took out a copy of the old file. Not the original leather binder. That was evidence now. This was a clean folder with corrected pages, witness names restored, missing transfers added, and one final page left blank until that evening. He placed it in front of Lena first. "Nothing in here decides who you are," he said. "It only corrects what was done." Lena read the final page. "Found alive. Legal identity restoration pending by choice of the adult concerned." She looked at the blank line below it. "You did not write daughter." Charles shook his head. "That is yours to allow." Lena picked up the pen. Her hand hovered for a moment. Then she wrote, "Found alive, as Lena Brooks, once Emily Whitmore, still becoming herself." Nia leaned close to read it, her bracelet shining softly in the sunset. Charles watched the words settle onto the page and felt something inside him finally loosen. Not grief ending. Grief does not end because truth arrives. But grief can change shape. It can stop being a locked room and become a table where people sit down carefully, honestly, one evening at a time. Charles closed the file, not to bury it, but to protect what had finally been restored. Outside, Oak Park traffic moved gently past the window. Inside, a father did not reclaim a daughter like property. A woman did not surrender the life she had built. A grandmother saw a promise kept. And a little black girl who had once crossed a ballroom with a whisper watched two broken histories begin speaking to each other in full sentences.